I'm like, you've got to be kidding me, because these tents are used for open air use of drugs.
Welcome to the Restorations Podcast. I'm Caitlyn McKenney, and my guest on this episode is Andrea Suarez. Andrea is the founder of We Heart Seattle, a grassroots outreach organization focused on cleaning up the city. They recently hit 1.2 million pounds of trash picked up. That's all with volunteers. And I love her work because I think it's a pretty tangible expression of what it means to restore our city, which is what we're all about here on the Restorations Podcast, being informed on policy, issues surrounding homelessness, addiction, and crime, so that we can see human lives restored to their fullest potential and cities flourishing as a result of that. But before we hear from Andrea, let's break down a couple of newsworthy items. In case you missed it, a King County SWAT team was sent to an apartment in Auburn, which is a city south of Seattle, recently to serve a high-risk eviction order. The investigation is ongoing, but at the moment it appears that officers were shot at and then returned fire in self-defense, killing the person inside the home. We don't know for certain at this point if the person who was killed was the tenant of the home. But a human life was lost, which is always tragic. These kinds of evictions, I think, should be deeply concerning to us. They are a sign of either two things. One, a resident with serious mental illness who's putting themselves and others at risk if not immediately and carefully and properly attended to, or a resident who's criminally violent and should be involved in the criminal justice system, if not already involved in the criminal justice system. I think it's completely fair to expect that neither of those types of individuals who are at risk of harm to themselves or others has to be your next door neighbor. And the eviction process is designed to protect living communities from people who are a threat to their safety. And when that process is not working well, people end up getting hurt. Either other residents or the landlord or law enforcement, or in this case, the tenant themselves. And that's a completely different perspective than, say, the perspective of the Democratic Socialists of America, who view evictions as inherently violent and traumatic. In this case, and it's not the only case, there are others, it's the resident, not the eviction itself, that is violent and causes trauma. Groups like the DSA have such a hard time recognizing any form of personal responsibility here. Responsibility for not paying rent, or for breaking the terms of your contract, or for meeting a SWAT team at your front door with gunfire. Let's start placing some fair and warranted blame on violent tenants instead of just using the concept of evictions as a scapegoat for their behavior. Okay, the University of Washington has an Addiction, Drug, and Alcohol Institute, and I recently attended a webinar they hosted titled Safe Supply: What It Is, Do People Want It, and What Impacts Might It Have? And in case you don't know, the concept of safe supply, which has been put into practice in Canada, is that basically if we have doctors prescribe opioids to addicts, instead of addicts buying illicit drugs on the streets, then they'll be less likely to die from an overdose. And according to this webinar, there are several safe supply models, including ones where no prescription is involved and you actually go to a dispensary and you buy your illicit drugs. And I want to credit the presenter in this webinar for being relatively, all things considered, fair and honest, including being very honest about the desire and goal to get the governor of Washington State to implement safe supply here in Washington. Here's one particularly honest moment from the conversation. Take a listen.
And there are different models of safe supply, as we've talked about, each with their pros and cons to consider. And as we move forward and think about this, I like the saying that there's a lot of wrong ways that we can do this. And I don't necessarily know if there's a right one, but implementation moving forward needs to be done very carefully.
And that's a statement that I can actually get behind. There is no right way, in my opinion, to give users of deadly drugs more deadly drugs. I think that will always be wrong. And there was lots of research and charts and numbers presented in this webinar, which I look forward to digging into in the future. But I think that all of that can be a distraction from just a very fundamental premise that lies beneath all of this. If I think that the best thing for an addict is to be free from a life of addiction, then I think there's something fundamentally wrong with anything that aids or enables an addiction. And no amount of research is going to change that. Now, all of that changes if you think that the best thing for an addict is simply whatever they think is best for themselves. And for some, that's treatment with an end goal of abstinence. And for others, it's to continue using drugs, but to be able to do it safely. And once you're at that point and you have that premise, then you start asking how you can create a society and government that facilitates both of those goals. And in that case, doctors prescribing drugs for addicts is totally acceptable. Now, I'm all for keeping people safe and alive so that they can live free and healthy and happy lives. And I think that addiction is in opposition to all of those things, to freedom, to health and happiness. If you start hearing more about safe supply in Washington or any other state, think about the fundamental beliefs that lie underneath it. Now let's hear from Andrea Suarez of We Heart Seattle. Okay, welcome, Andrea, to the Restorations Podcast. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Caitlyn. I'm glad to be here, and I'm really, really proud of the work that you're doing with fixing homelessness. It is the best policy advice, literature, studies that I've seen in the world. Anything that I've seen, what you guys are doing is incredible and 100% in alignment with what I see on the streets and what I think solutions are. So I'm looking forward to getting into that with you today.
Wow, thank you. Us too, and we're big fans of your work here at Fix Homelessness and excited to hear more from you today. Can you start by telling us how you entered the world of outreach and a little bit about your work now as the founder of We Heart Seattle?
We Heart Seattle was founded 3.5 years ago out of frustration with the garbage and needles everywhere and my neighbors in despair on our sidewalks, in our parks, under bridges. It just was this wake-up call I had one morning and thought, what are we going to do about it? So I called my mayor, I called my city council member, I called our parks, our cops, our Seattle Public Utilities, our waste management, who's in charge of all the trash? It was everywhere, and there were needles everywhere. Went down to the needle exchange. I'm like, where's the exchange? And, it was a little bit flippant, back in the fall of 2020, right smack in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And after all of that fell flat because it was shelter in place, do nothing, Adopt a Street program wasn't working, the Find It, Fix It app wasn't really active, I started cleaning up graffiti and picking up the needles myself. And really that just entailed getting a red Sharps box and a box of Home Depot bags. And I started in Denny Park, where ultimately there was 165 tents and tens of thousands of pounds of trash and thousands of needles everywhere, including on the children's playground. Through volunteers, restored that park to a place that it can be enjoyed for all, by all, for its intended purposes. So we're really proud to have launched the movement based on just showing, like, if we all work together and work with the people living there in the tents to work together and to find solutions, that is possible. And we've proved that over and over and over again in over 35 parks, having now cleaned 1.2 million pounds of trash, 35,000 needles off the ground, helped hundreds of people get off the street, into treatment, into housing, back home. We love family reunification. Sadly, 12 passed away bodies, and of course are in the belly of the beast of the intersectionalities of addiction, untreated mental health, and public safety. That is the outcome of the do nothing approach that we have in our city of Seattle.
I love how tangible it is, picking up trash, right? It's like a very clear transformation of a space. And also I think you found a way to engage people on a more deep level and get them into treatment, get them connected with families. Any super powerful moments or stories that you guys have experienced?
The truth lies beneath the trash. It is so powerful. It's like, do small, think big, and just by taking that immediate action of picking up the trash and then learning about all the different bureaucratic, red tape around whose trash is it? Is it on parks? Is it on city? Is it on WashDOT? Is it on rail? Is it in a slope? And I learned right away that there was 2 policies in the city of Seattle that kept the tents and the trash on the slopes. And there's a 20-foot rule that no agency, except for a very small group, and today it's called the Unified Care Team, before it was the navigation team, could go and actually knock on that tent's door and say, welfare check, anybody home? How are you?
Interesting.
Nobody's allowed to go within 20 feet of a tent. And then the second policy is you're not allowed to work on slopes. So the city of Seattle's built on 7 hills, and all of the green belts and urban hiking trails are on slopes. And so one of the biggest, most historical, if not the most historical, urban trail restoration in the state of Washington was done by We Heart Seattle volunteers in 2020. It's the Northeast Queen Anne Greenbelt, known as the McLean Trail. And there was over 100,000 pounds of trash, 10,000 needles, and it was touted on TripAdvisor as the #1 urban hiking trail that connected Upper Queendown to 99 South and on the bus line. So we were seeing tourists come through and hop through what was about 15 to 20 abandoned camps. And there was like one other camp that was active that eventually, was broken down. But what I wanted to say about that restoration was that it was on a slope and it had been there for decades that way. And the response from the city was, it's just too complicated. It's too complicated. The greenbelts are a low priority by parks. And, how do you go about it? And why volunteerism is so important and is part of a well-run government is by choice. We went into the slopes, we picked up the needles, and we're able to restore that park and house the people that were living there or get them to go back to the housing they had, which is another really big eye-opening thing that I had and have during the movement is how many people have hangouts in the parks and in the green belt with a nice, big, beautiful, shiny key around their neck. And so there's a woman, for example, that has DESC housing, and she has multiple friends in the Northwest Queen Anne Greenbelt. And she's my educator. And she says, oh, yeah, I'm kind of everybody's girlfriend around here. Okay. And, she hops from tent to tent and whatever. And those tents are revolving doors of whoever is there to prey on her, frankly, as a sex worker.
Yeah.
And she does.
And she has housing. You're saying she has supportive housing through DESC, but she's a frequenter of
and that creates the trash, that creates the fires that you see. And last night, we've now heard the stabbing in Kinnear Park, which is these parks are connected to these green belts. Also, another big eye-opening time was when we were doing outreach and cleaning on Western Avenue between Marion and Columbia, right here near your office. There was tents and trash and broken down cars. The whole block was basically taken over. And another outreach organization came by and went, all these people have hotels at the Palladian. And that is when I'm like, you've got to be kidding me, because these tents are used for open air use of drugs. It's an open air drug market. That's the deal. This is all rooted in drug addiction. And so that's when I started getting even more noisy, saying, well, then why are we not navigating or sweeping or relocating or resolving or just trespassing people off of public sidewalks? They have housing. And I started using our donations to get people storage, start their cars. But that was a big eye-opener, is not every tent is a home. In fact, most people have multiple tents, and they have them in every district in the city. And I have that on camera and on testimony from my educator. He says, oh, yeah, I have a tent in Soto, here off of Dearborn and up on Cap Hill, because it's the open air drug market that we have here in Seattle.
I think that's really important for people to understand that most tents are, well, maybe not most, but a lot, significant number are drug use, open air drug use spaces, dens. Not every tent means one homeless person who needs a place to live. Just the complexity there. I think something that We Heart Seattle has done really successfully is empower regular, ordinary people to be involved. And I think I've heard you say before, and you can correct me if this is wrong, but that anyone and everyone can and should be an outreach worker. We don't see that happening. Like, we don't see just regular people all the time engaging with people on the streets. And I know I'll be the first to admit that for me, I pass by people all the time who I acknowledge in my mind need help, and I walk past them. And I think there's a number of reasons behind that. It could be fear of how they are going to react or respond to me. I think there's kind of a defeatist mentality that's like, I don't know if I could actually help them. I don't know what I have to offer them. And I don't know if, I'm not convinced that emergency services has anything to offer them or can help them. The third kind of barrier to doing outreach and stopping and engaging someone on the streets is just how normalized it's become. Like, I can be walking home from work or to the bus in a crowd of pedestrians, right? And we're all passing the same people that we know need help. And the abnormal thing to see would be someone stop and engage with someone. What's your advice on how to start if we care and we want to help, but we're scared or we don't know. I'm not saying that any of those justifications that I just gave are good justifications. They're not. But your thoughts on that?
Well, my mantra is everybody is an outreach worker and can be an outreach worker, even if it is to say hello, acknowledge. Just a very, very simple example. I was on 3rd and Lenora recently, and a woman was really struggling. She was hunched over. She was kind of nodding out and kind of doing this, and she didn't have shoes on. And, we were both at the sidewalk waiting to cross the street. And I said, "Hey, good morning." And she kind of went, "Oh." And then I thought, oh, gosh, she's going to say something like, "Mind your own business," or something. She goes, "Oh, wow, thank you. Yeah, I was like, no problem." And then, we were walking across the street and she said, "Hey, lady." And I thought, oh man, here, mind your own business or something. She goes, "Thank you." If more people did that, I would do less drugs. I would feel more loved, more nurtured. This is about self-loathing, shame, embarrassment, lack of self-worth, and you just gave me all of that in 1 second. And I stood up straight. I was zonked out. Couldn't tell where I was. And it's so simple. You really can just say, "Hello, how are you today? Good morning." The other extreme side of things is we'll talk about Lawnmower Man in Ballard. Was all over the news as the angry man who had 20 lawnmowers that were blocking the sidewalk, and we went up to him and we just said, "How much are all your lawnmowers, man?" And he goes, $20 a piece or 10 if they're broken. And I said, "I'll take all of them." And then he goes, "Well, I actually work through Uplift Northwest." And I go, "So now I'm going to pay you $20 an hour to help me put them in my truck, and so we can restore the sidewalk for all to use." And it was just this really quick, nuanced, it was a few $100, but you can solve that problem too. Solve the problem. You want your sidewalk back. He has stuff to sell. Eventually, Charles Woodward went back home to family in Arizona after months of working with us and figuring out a long-term plan that reunification with family is something we can all do. He needed new tires for his van and his tabs paid, and off he went. Sometimes it's, I just need to call my mom. I just got out of jail. I'm stuck. Can I use your phone? And then there's very complex cases. But if we just took care of a lot of people who aren't as complex, then we could actually put the resources on the people who have the most complex disabilities, whether it's untreated mental health or substance abuse disorders. There is more of us who can support somebody who could use a hand up. And what if all 736,000 Seattleites lent a little bit more of a helping hand than keep saying it's a government response, a government response, a government response? Because with no government money and all volunteers, for our first couple years, we made our biggest impact. And everybody can pick up litter, too.
Yeah, there was a series done recently that was critical of your work of We Heart Seattle. And one of the things that they had a concern about was the fact that you're not a licensed caseworker, social worker. And you had a great response to that. I'll put it up here for people to see.
But in terms of state or city license for caseworking,
I don't know, did Jesus Christ have a license?
It's the DRE.
Any other thoughts on that in connection to this idea that we can all be outreach workers and engage people?
There's no requirement for you to have a license to be a social worker, an advocate, a life coach. If you're identifying with the way that you help a person reach their best self, reach self-sufficiency, or give them a hand up. I see people that want to make 1,000 sandwiches and they go hand out 1,000 sandwiches. And I think, why don't you take all that effort and go spend that same amount of time and sit with somebody and take them out for a tavern burger and a beer? You'll reach that person. I guarantee it, you will. But to that, response in why I think we are effective and an expansion of the services that are out there is our folks living rough in the camps and go, "Who are you again?" We go, "Well, we're a private funded outreach group and, we do waste management as a form of harm reduction. We start with that. Do you want to participate with us? We have basic needs stipend cards." We kind of create that do something for something culture, because I think that inflates the psychological drive, not deflates it by just here's something. That's not how we're deflating the psychological drive for folks, and we're keeping people stuck in where they're at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just let the results speak for themselves, right? And yours obviously have. I want to pivot now here for a second. You are running to be a representative in the Washington State House of Representatives. Can you tell us what neighborhoods you're running to represent, and then why you decided to make a full leap into politics?
Sure. Yeah, it's a natural next step. We've been boots on the ground for 3.5 years. I've collected 13,000 hours of field work on the back of our volunteers, and my educators being folks with addiction and untreated mental health, living in tents, teaching me what they need, what's working and what's not. It's time, and it's a civic duty because of our opponents too, who are part of the way why our state is in the state that it is. Why is there millions of pounds of trash in our green belts? Why aren't our parks accessible, but instead breeding grounds for murder, rape, stabbings, shootings, fires, all of which have happened in the last 5 days? And I want to get into Olympia and bring that boots on ground, field work, and common sense to correct bad law, stop bad law, and make new law that is more humane. I don't want to be boxed out by any party. I am me, and it feels like a personal responsibility to take what I know and help this state be a better place for all. And Housing First is failing people with untreated mental health and addiction. 100%. I know it. We have housed dozens and dozens and dozens of people and tried it. I've tried it so many times, and they leave and abandon their homes, or they're dying in their homes in the same squalid, rat-infested, roach-infested conditions that they have outside. In fact, if not worse, because they're preyed on. And so I want to bring that to Olympia.
Yeah, and I hope that message of common sense and of uniting people on this issue across the political spectrum will resonate with a lot of people in our state. Here's also a post that Sean, your opponent, made on his campaign Twitter account, X account. He says, "Our primary opponent," referring to you, "opposes supportive housing for people experiencing houselessness. It's bunk. We're proud to have the support of Rep. Nicole McCree, as seatmates will be committed to leading on Housing First policies in Olympia." And you were just touching on this, and if you want to touch on it further, do you support supportive housing? And what are your thoughts on Housing First?
I support Housing First for people who are housing ready. People who are in the throes of their addiction to the number one killing poison in the United States, which is fentanyl mixed with feth. Everyone's taken both. That they are dying inside, and there's not any accountability to move them towards self-sufficiency or independence. If we can all work together, and Housing First comes with a treatment program, we're good. But it's not. I see it from my own eyes. I can look into these buildings and see that it's in perpetuity. There's never and now we are going to work on your untreated mental health issues and your substance abuse addiction. We are welcoming conversations with all candidates. We are here to talk about this like adults, like professionals, like policy experts, and bring in diversity of thought so we can land on something that works for all, not your own ideology.
Any last thoughts on either your work with We Heart Seattle or your race and what you hope to accomplish?
Yeah, thank you for separating them. Our nonprofit, We Heart Seattle, is not endorsing directly or indirectly my campaign or any campaign. We can't, you can't, we know that. But we can have conversations with each other and explore what people will do when they run. For me, it's all about saving lives, restoring the environment for all. I am a hardcore environmentalist, and everyone's talking about gas taxes and global warming, and I'm like, there's trash and bottles and feces going into the Duwamish River right now. Why is it there? Yeah. So I'm a person that is like, what is right in front of me right now? We can talk about what's happening in the next 50 to 100 years, but right now, I'm really all about taking action incrementally on what we can do to end the death and despair of our brothers and sisters, that an entire 747 airplanes falling from the sky every single day. And that's why I say to my opponent, treatment first.
Yeah.
It's very simple for me.
Absolutely. Powerful. Thank you for sharing. And can you also share with us where people can follow you and support your work?
We Heart Seattle, it can be found, weheartseattle.org.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrea, for joining us. If you're not already familiar with Andrea or with We Heart Seattle, I hope you learned a lot from that conversation. I think Andrea is a great example of seeing things that are wrong in your city and then actually stepping up and stepping in and taking action. I want to echo her thoughts on viewpoint diversity. We don't endorse candidates at Fix Homelessness or on this show, and would welcome any candidate who wants to have an honest dialogue about the things that they stand for. I respect Andrea for being willing to have those conversations. Okay, we are all very familiar with the pervasive narrative that tenants are the vulnerable victims of powerful, greedy landlords. And while there may be cases where that is true, that characterization is very simplistic and often far from reality. I write a regular series of articles providing a different perspective with real stories and cases from the world of housing. You can find them at fixhomelessness.org. And my latest asks the question, does poverty explain evictions? That's the narrative we so often hear, that tenants miss one paycheck and then they're evicted, and that evictions are purely economic. If that's the case, we would expect to see a correlation among the general population between rates of poverty and rates of eviction. So in places where there's higher rates of poverty, we'd expect to see more evictions. I used data from the King County Bar Association to show that, in fact, there is a pretty weak correlation between rates of poverty and eviction filings in zip codes across King County. If you're watching, you'll see a graph on the screen and notice a good amount of variation among zip codes. I also used data from Princeton's eviction lab, and you'll notice that the association gets extremely weak when we're looking at counties across Washington state. Here we see even more variation among counties, and we actually see a slightly negative correlation. If evictions were driven by purely economic causes, I don't think we would see this data. And if it's true that poverty does not explain evictions, then policy aimed at preventing eviction should not be merely or purely economic. Likely, most evictions are surrounded by complex circumstances, a mix of personal and environmental factors, some within and some outside a tenant's control. Since poverty alone can't explain a prevalence of evictions, money alone can't be the answer. Without accounting for this fact, housing policy and eviction aid will be at best unsustainable and at worst harmful to all parties involved. Thank you for watching this episode of the Restorations Podcast. Follow or subscribe wherever you're watching or listening so that you don't miss the next episode.